Good morning, everyone. Can you hear at all? All right. It's 8:45, and in the interest of being prompt and on time, we're just going to jump right into it. Thanks for coming at this very first session of the day. I know there's a lot of great competing sessions, so it's great to see so many of you here who want to hear about data visualization and data and all the great things. I just want to make a quick plug for the Data Insights SIG, who have sponsored this session, and there is the SIG meeting tomorrow afternoon. If you're interested in data, meet up with those people at 12:30. Check your schedules. Can I turn it up? I don't know that I can. I don't know that I have those powers. Just speak closer. Okay, there we go. All right, yeah, so you're in the room for this session, Beyond the Graphing Calculator, a deep dive into data visualization, and we're just going to take a deep dive. So I'm turning it over to our first presenter, Jessica.
That's a good way to start. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jessica Milby. I'm the Assistant Director for Collection Information at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. That means that I manage our collection database, which happens to be TMS. I might mention that later. Our digitization projects, distribution, content enhancement, that kind of stuff. So we use data visualization both for communicating data and ideas simply, clearly, quickly. We also use it for analysis and intelligence, as you might kind of expect, and looking for patterns and correlations in our data. Lately, we've been asking a lot of questions about our audience and trying to answer them with actual data instead of sort of anecdotal stories about, well, I have this experience when I look at this stuff. So audience research and surveys are really a great way to do that. But the largest audience we have is online. And we're looking at Google Analytics data for the activities of our online collection pages to sort of get an idea of what that audience is looking at. Online analytics is like kind of ugly, but it's easy to access, and there's quite a lot of it. So you can mine through tons of stuff. There's a lot of insight to be found, but it looks kind of garbagey, and if you don't really understand what you're looking at, it can be easy to misinterpret misinterpret your data. And I want to make the point of saying, like, I know that there is no proven correlation between on-site and online visitation, but for me, I think that doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't consider what the online audience is looking at when we're talking about on-site visits, or that we can have a conversation strictly about our online audience and what kind of digital content we offer on our website for them. So American Art is reinstalling their galleries, and we have this curatorial assistant helping to organize those efforts. So I sort of like grabbed her and said, hey, do you think that those curators might want to think about what the larger online audience has been interested in the American Art objects? See what sort of stories they might be able to tell by sort of connecting with the more popular objects. And one of our curators actually made that face. Like he was like, "This has nothing to do with me," you know. And the online sort of popularity of an object is not on a curator's mind, and that's completely legitimate. But for me, I was kind of like, if they knew that thousands of people were responding to some sort of arcane chair in the American Art collection, for some reason, a lot of people were clicking on this chair. They might want to highlight the lesser known object that they have a story to tell about in conversation with this really popular online object. There's no reason you can't take the sort of popular thing and drag the other one up into the forefront of people's minds. So, when I sold it to them that way, it was kind of like, oh, yeah, I might do that. Having the knowledge is better than not. So even if they ignore it, even if they say, well, these things are popular, I don't care, I told you what you needed to know. You make your curatorial decisions. So I had already spent kind of a lot of time and effort to look at Google data like page views for collection objects pages by their internal metadata, like curatorial department. And it took several really bad tries, like this kind of nonsense on the left, which I apologize, these are hard to read. They're all interactive, and they're really designed to be this close to your face. So it's hard to see them in a slide. So I got through a lot of bad stuff until I got to something that had some sort of meaningful intelligence, like the visualization on the right. And so I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. To Google, a page is a page, like it's a URL, and that's kind of all of the categories you have about it. You can get demographics of your user, their location, age group, the device that they're on, all that great sort of stuff, but you can't ask it like what the most popular objects are by the American Art Curatorial Department, because that's an internal data point. So I had to make the Google data sensible and digestible to an internal audience, and I needed to be able to talk about segments of the collection that would be meaningful to that curatorial group, and in this case, it was American art. For me, I use Tableau, and it's a data visualization tool which accommodates data source blending. So you can bring in two separate databases, you can connect to two separate servers and extract information. You can also schedule live updates. It's really great because I make the visualization and it refreshes itself. I don't have to go back and say, update. And the trickiest part about this was really that the page URL, although it contains an object ID, contains a lot of other garbage. And in order to have a primary key to link the two data sets together, I had several migraines, and eventually this happened. It was so much harder than that. I wish I could have just clicked a button and made that happen. But that's the key. It's just, if you want to take these two disparate sets of data and you think you've got something to learn from bringing them together, you've got to find a way to plug them into each other. So now I could visualize data like the sum of the page views for an attribute from TMS, like the department. In this case, this is paintings for American objects by Place Made. So you have to look at these with some skepticism. This one is over time, which is great, bringing in another dimension. But it's this at the top line that is Pennsylvania, which it seems very high, and it's kind of like, are works made in Pennsylvania so much more popular, or are they simply more numerous? And, we're in Pennsylvania, so they're more numerous. This one is super messy, but at the top is Gallery 182, which is one of our modern and contemporary galleries. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, is everyone really interested in Gallery 182, or is there one really popular object in that gallery? And it happens to be that Nude Descending the Staircase is in there, and everyone clicks on that. It's I think consistently our most clicked on object. So in this though, you say okay, well, paintings are at the top, little bit of up and down over time, but they're significantly more interesting. People are significantly more interested in it than the rest of the categories. And it is actually true that the paintings, although there aren't more of them, are simply more popular. We have 100 and some thousand prints, but they're way down. So the aggregate views are hard to understand and much less translate into curatorial action. So I drill down to the individual objects. And here you can see the most popular objects. Jumped ahead. For objects with the greatest sum of page views over about a 2-year period for American arts paintings. And this is when things started to click, talking to the curators to say, oh, okay, so 12,000 page views or however many it is. They started to get kind of excited about it at that point. We started to refine it and looking at the paintings made before 1830. Page views go down a little bit. But this was an inquiry directly from the working group and a way to start talking about their inquiry instead of my experiment. We also drilled into the furniture and the silver. And the whole thing really kind of went a bit backwards, because usually someone comes to you with a question, you look at your data and you try to find a way to visualize an answer for them and analyze what your data says to you. So I had the visualization to demonstrate the resource so that I could start saying, okay, so this is what I have that I can get answers from. What are your questions? But I think it kind of worked, because I don't think they would have understood the resource and the possibilities otherwise. So a couple of the possible outcomes, they noticed that some objects were really popular despite the fact that they were never on view. Really hard to get a curator to not talk about the galleries, right? The online audience is still a little bit of a disconnect. but there might have been terrible images. It might need some conservation work. So these things were really, interesting to the public. And it might be justification to have them conserved. It might be justification to have them rephotographed if, thousands of people are looking at them. So we hope that we can get more accurate time on page metrics moving forward, so we know how long that person is engaging with a page, find out what those pages have in common, and build more collection information of that type. And we're also going to be enhancing what we offer on our online pages, like styles and movements for everything. So we'll look at the most popular styles and movements, the most popular objects, and see if what I was predicting would happen actually does happen. Do the really popular Impressionist paintings bring up to the fore more of the less popular paintings? So we'll see what happens. I think it's got a lot of potential, and the curators actually did seem interested. So that's it. Thanks.
Can everyone hear me in the back? All right, good morning. My name is Elizabeth Bollwerk, and this morning I'm going to talk with you a little bit about some work we've been doing at Monticello that's focused on effective data visualization for education and communication. So one common problem that a lot of museums face is that communicating our active role as research institutions in addition to exhibition and curatorial institutions can be difficult for certain audiences. And as our friend Indiana Jones is so eloquently articulating here, there is this public perception that a lot of objects are valuable and should be in museums, but our audiences don't necessarily understand that a large part of the reason they should be in museums is because a lot of institutions have very active research programs that are seeking to use these collections to answer very real questions. So today I wanted to share a little bit of a case study with you about some of the work we've been doing at Monticello to communicate to our audiences about our research that we're doing behind the scenes that informs our interpretation, but is also seeking to answer questions about enslavement. And you may be familiar with Monticello. It's the home of Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, our third president, pictured in the lower right-hand corner here. You may recognize it from the back of the nickel. And we are a historic house museum, but we're also much more, as you can see from this list of what our institution does. And I'm housed in the archaeology department. It's part of our research wing. And the department has a longstanding research program, a very active one, that focuses on understanding the livelihood and lifeways of Thomas Jefferson's enslaved workforce. The plantation ran on enslaved labor for his lifetime, so we're very interested in trying to understand more about that history of a group of people who are really not covered in the historic record. And we have two halves. One is a lab and field component that works actively on excavations on the mountaintop. The other is a project called the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, which is where I'm housed. And the project consists of a large relational database of archaeological collections from over 80 sites in the southeastern US and Caribbean. And we have a website through which we make all that data open and freely available to whoever wants to use it. And a large part of our mission is trying to foster scholarly collaboration and research on enslavement, trying to learn how people adapted to and endured the large demographic, social, economic forces that were changing their lives in the 18th and 19th century. So we focus on data that comes from enslaved domestic sites from this area, and you can kind of see a brief summary of that here. But another large part of our mission is to do outreach and education. And we work with a lot of faculty and museum professionals to do data research and visualization. As part of that, we use a number of data visualization tools, including ArcGIS mapping software to look at spatial distributions of material culture at different sites and between different sites. We also use R-scripts to do statistical analysis to look at different frequencies of assemblages, to try and understand how enslaved people are using material culture in different ways in different regions. And we also use Excel for some of our data visualization for some of our more straightforward interests and questions. But as we expand to look into communicating with different audiences, we've been experimenting with some other data visualization techniques. So one of the things that we've been doing recently is working on a series of National Endowment for the Humanities sponsored workshops with K through 12 educators who are interested in using digital resources in their classroom. So these workshops have been running for about 3 hours. We've done them 5 times now with about 30 K through 12 teachers who are interested in understanding the data analysis process in archaeology, trying to use this data on enslavement to help educate their students about how enslaved people were living throughout the US and the Southeast. So when I was looking back on how we've developed our process, and it's been an iterative process and we learned a lot through these workshops, I found that some of our takeaways aligned really well with 4 key principles that I've seen come up in some of the visualization literature that we were reading through as we were trying to develop these workshops. And so for the rest of my presentation, I'm just going to focus a little bit on these 4 key principles and how we kind of incorporated them into our process and what we learned along the way while we were doing this. So I'll start with show the data. And I'll say for us, the first time we did the workshop, we are data geeks. We thought the teachers would really love to use Excel. I don't know why, but we thought they would. We quickly learned that that was not an effective way. Giving them raw spreadsheets of quantitative numbers was not an effective way to communicate what archaeological data looks like. So in hindsight, we realized very quickly that because we're used to seeing things like ceramic sherds all the time, and that's what we use for some of our analyses, we actually had to bring those objects out and let them handle them and see them and show how we handle them and research and analyze them, for them to be able to think through our data analysis process. And part of our goal was to guide them through the process we use to date sites using ceramics. So we realized in stepping back that we had to show them the data in a very real and tangible way for them to be able to take that next step with us to understand how we analyze that data moving forward. So instead of using raw spreadsheets or spreadsheets of raw numbers, we brought out the ceramics, sorted them with them, talked about the different types we see, and had them handle them, which I think was a much more effective way of actually showing them what we do. The next one is reducing the clutter. And again, for us, this meant essentially getting rid of the digital, which was really difficult for us because we rely a lot on digital data as part of our analysis process. But what we wanted to do to highlight our method, which is looking at different amounts of ceramics between different archaeological sites, was to revisualize that data in a tangible or physical format. So you can see there's this long board here that represents an archaeological assemblage. We created cardboard cutouts of the different ceramic types and had the teachers match those types to the categories on the board. And at the end, what we had was essentially a visualization of all the different frequencies of the types in the assemblage. And part of the exercise then was we had 3 or 4 of these boards that then the teachers could look at and compare and see that, oh, because this site has more of this type than this one, it's earlier or later. And we found that the teachers, by simplifying and reducing this concept into something that was more of a physical visualization than necessarily a digital one in Excel or R or ArcGIS, because they could kind of follow us through the process and take part in the process, it was really a more effective way of communicating what we wanted them to learn and how that process works. The next one is integrate text and images. And for us, this really meant just, in addition to us walking them through the process, giving them text handouts that really showed everything step by step and walking them through each of those steps as we were doing them. And part of that as well was allowed us to then go ahead and calculate a formula, which in the initial workshop proved to be very difficult because teachers were still struggling to grasp what the data was, what the process was, but kind of walking them through with these physical visualizations first, we're able to get to that final step. And we found that it was really effective because they actually understood what they were doing in a much more tangible way. And finally, portraying the data meaning accurately and ethically. So this really focuses on, even though you may be using a different medium for your visualization, not skimping on the accuracy or precision. And this can actually be much harder depending on the medium you're using. So a quick example here, a bar chart of water consumption per capita created on Excel, and then another way of visualizing it through glasses of water. But you still, when you're calculating for that example on the right, you still need to be using a scale and precision when you're measuring out those different liter amounts to make sure the underlying data is being accurately represented. For us, this meant having to go through and figure out how much each cardboard cutout, how many ceramics that would represent, and then calculating to make sure we had all of those correct in our physical visualization so we were accurately representing the underlying assemblage. And this was actually more work than just giving them raw spreadsheets that we had imported or exported out of our database. But we found that because this was an easier medium for them to communicate with, it really was worth the extra time and effort to put it together. So just to close really quickly, for us, we found that we had to really think about customizing our data visualization for this particular purpose. When we're working with, say, faculty or museum professionals, using tools like ArcGIS and R are really effective, but when we're shifting audiences, we have to really be thinking about how we're communicating and working with them and thinking about shifting what our processes are. And we really also had to reduce our desire to show the really cool and sexy stuff we do, because our goal was to guide these teachers along in our process so they understood what we were doing and how. And eventually we got them to the cool and sexy stuff, but we had to take multiple kind of layers and methods to get there. And some of that didn't include using digital visualization. It was really integrating physical and digital that helped us get where we wanted to go. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Steward. I'm from the Harvard Art Museums, and I'm going to take us out of the deep dive and maybe bring us back up to the surface a little bit to talk about some experiments we're doing with abstract and sort of artful data visualization, and really for the purpose of inspiring and getting internal audiences to think differently about the way we use collections and the way we use cultural institutions. So, okay. I will do my best. So yeah, Harvard Art Museums, we're a teaching museum at a research university. We have about 250,000 art objects. And we know a lot of stuff about our objects. So we tend to know things like where it was made, who made it, where it was found, and how things were acquired. This is a rough sketch of how we think about objects on an individual level and the constellation of all the kinds of data we collect about it. And by default, we visualize our collections in ways like this. You know, it's a bunch of lists and grids, and it's very sterile. And so this is our interface. It's a very scholarly interface. It's good for answering, specific types of questions, but it does a lot of things like assume a certain baseline of understanding, and it works only well when you have really good cataloging. And then the other fundamental thing and problem for me is that it assumes you think about collections and objects like we do. And since you don't live in our heads, that's a bit of a problem. So going forward, the premise for the next few slides is pretty simple. I got a bunch of very vague and open-ended questions that are often churning through my head, and so I've wanted to explore them through data visualization tools. So I'm going to just show you a few quick examples of some of the work that we're doing. And so we're really focused on how we can explore our data in new ways, push the boundaries of what our data can do for us, allow us to shift our perspective, and then sort of open doors to other people who might not be engaged with art museums. So, okay, a really quick video of a web application that it's a different take on viewing floor plans and objects within the museum. So a bunch of different graphs written in D3. This is all interactive, and there's links that are embedded in this presentation, so you can play with this on your own. And it's taking all of the collections data that exists in our TMS system, and it's just reorienting it so people can visualize the entirety of the museum in one go. And there's a lot of attributes tucked away in here to allow you to understand how our collection is oriented within the museum. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but some of the guiding questions here are how can we make the museum more compelling for repeat visitors? So one of the ways you can filter and color code data is when did it go on view in the last 5 days, in the last 30 days, in the last year. So if you come back every week, you can ask simple questions like, what's new on view? What can I go see that I didn't see last time? What galleries can I avoid because I'm tired of seeing the same thing in there? And here we're going into the pushing the boundaries area where we're trying to be a little bit more playful with what we do and really work on this idea of creative reuse of cultural data. So again, just another interactive visualization of color extraction from the images in our collection and running it just in a very playful way where there's a secondary interface that lets you control this data and just play around with it. And what you're seeing is one object in our collection randomly appear every second. The colors in it sort of fan out from the center of each of those suns. The title is there, and it's just playful. And some of the guiding questions here are really, how elastic can our data be? What can we do that's playful? And how can we represent objects in the collection without actually showing the images? That's a really big one for me. And so moving on to maybe something slightly more practical and building on some of the topics Jessica brought up. This falls under the banner of data landscapes, where really trying to shift our perspective on our collections. And what you're seeing is about 9 years of data about the entirety of the collection playback for you. So you can see what every object was doing on a particular day, how many page views it had, how many edits in the database, how many times was it physically moved, was it in our conservation studio, was it in our study center. So you get a really sense of the life of the entirety of the collection and how it changes over time. And you get a very quick sense of what the outliers are and how there are very large swaths of our collection that don't ever get viewed. So why is that? How might we then probe that data to figure out, is this data that's worth its keep? Are these objects worth their keep? How might we change our approach to cataloging and the way we treat those objects to bring them to the surface and make use of them? 250,000 objects is not a cheap thing to care for. So why do we do it? If this. Some of the guiding questions for this, too, is a really, really basic one. What if I could look at 250,000 objects at once? What might it look like? So here's one attempt. It's not necessarily the right way to do it, but when you want to start probing vast quantities of data, you just need to kind of immerse yourself in it, which leads me to another question is can data be immersive? What if I could literally walk amongst the data and change my perspective that way? And you could think of some really fun ways to do that using VR and like a Tron-like interface. You just get in the computer and actually live amongst this data. What might you learn? Who knows? And then one other visualization on the playful side of things is just taking other visual metaphors and applying them, looking to other disciplines like astrophysics or celestial mechanics and throwing your attributes into some of those concepts and see what happens. So again, this is the entirety of the collection mapped out as a series of solar systems. So basically creating a universe out of our collection. Each classification is treated as a sun, and it's scaled proportionally by the volume of or number of objects in that. And then radiating out from each sun are rings and planets with sub-attributes used to define what those planets are. In this case, are centuries. But again, this is an attempt to appeal to people outside the humanities and might not feel an affinity towards museum collections. Just what kind of visual styles could we apply to attract them? And just to recap on what you've just seen, many of these were built with D3 and processing, free, open source. You just need to pipe your data into them. We have an API that allows us to basically stream data into a lot of these interfaces, and then because we're a TMS user, we got a bunch of SQL queries that could dump the data right out into these visualizations. So I'm going to stop there and leave you with these things to consider. And one of the reasons I can get away with applying data visual techniques like this is because, because some of these things, I know our data at least a little bit. The main reason, though, really is that because, going back to one of my first slides, that we're a teaching museum at a research university. So we're operating under the banner of exploration and really trying to push the boundaries of what we do. It makes sense for us to really just be fully exploratory and not set out to answer any grand questions, but really try to push the boundaries of what our data can do. Data visualization isn't going to solve all your problems. So it's just another tool in your arsenal. Keep that in mind if you're ever thinking about applying any of these techniques. And really keep in mind what motivates you and your institution. For us, it is that teaching aspect. And we lean on that very heavily when we're thinking about some of these concepts. So I'm going to leave you with that. And there is a link at the end of the presentation as well to a lot of the resources and notes. So thank you.
Good morning. My name is Neville Vakharia, and I'm a professor and research director at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And a lot of my research is focused on the role of museums from an organizational perspective, from a technological perspective, and from a sector-wide. So just as Jeff sort of backed up a bit to look more broadly at things, I'll be going even higher up and looking and sharing very briefly some research and technology development I conducted that looks at sort of the universe of museums in the United States. This project was basically built on some questions around the fact that there wasn't a clear catalog you could just pick up or download of all the museums in the United States. In fact, there were differing opinions on how many there were and where they were and even what is a museum. And so it made it hard for museums to advocate for themselves, to be able to make their own cases. So through a grant that I got from IMLS, I was able to work with a team of graduate students at my university and work directly with the research team at IMLS to kind of answer some foundational questions. You know, one was kind of how many are there and where are they? Secondly, if we had that information, how could we give it back to the field so that it could be used for some valuable and powerful analysis so that museum leaders, advocates, service organizations, researchers, and higher ed could benefit from it. So we first started this exploration by looking at the commonly sort of used definitions of museums, and we weren't going to get into that philosophical debate about what is and what isn't, but we did know that those definitions do have some limitations. For example, you know, they all use this idea of nonprofit. Well, that's one type of business structure, but there are some things that exist outside of that. They use this idea of permanent institution, and yes, many are, but what about temporal and time-based types of institutions and professional staff, whatever that means, you know, in the sense that, you know, if you look at it from that perspective, are we eliminating, you know, very vernacular and tradition-based museums that might fall out? So, for example, in terms of business structure, the City Museum in St. Louis is not a nonprofit. There are temporary and pop-up museums, like a museum that popped up in a shopping mall. And then there are just some really cool, quirky museums that fall outside the traditional definitions, like the Museum of Wonder, which is actually a drive-through museum, the Stoogeum, a museum dedicated to the Three Stooges, the Wizard of Oz Museum, and even the Pizza Museum in my hometown of Philadelphia, which also serves great pizza. So we said we're going to cast a wide net. We're not going to get into the weeds of definitions and things like that. And we said we're going to look at a wide range of scope and function, and we're going to try and capture as much information, as much data as we can on what these museums are and what they might be, and as much information as we could get. But we also wanted to be able to develop tools from this information, so we spent a lot of time speaking with stakeholders from museums, from service organizations, from AAM and other leading sort of thought leaders on that sort of thing. And we knew we had to do a lot of data gathering because there wasn't one place to get data. We knew we had to kind of review the data we got, and then we had to develop technology if we wanted to give that data back in a useful, usable format for the field. So the themes we heard when we started undertaking this process were, as you can see here, there isn't a comprehensive set of data on museums and the sector. That led to a lack of data-driven decision-making from people in both museums, the leaders of museums, but also within the service organizations whose role was to advocate for museums. They didn't have the information readily available when they needed it. And then there was a need to make data useful. You know, just having repositories wasn't going to be enough. Understanding that data on museums, but also linking it with community metrics came up as very important, and basically tools that could inform museums on where to do their programs, how to do their outreach, and even fundraising efforts came up in there. So what we did was we said, let's capture this universe of data. So we just started grabbing data wherever we could find it, however it existed. So looking at nonprofits through the IRS, looking at grantees, museums that receive grants, looking at post-secondary data to get things like museums that are part of universities, and even tapping and paying for some proprietary location data from a resource that has location-based data on about 20 to 30 million entities in the United States. And from that, we started compiling it, geocoding it, deduping. That's where grad students come in because, you know, technology and sort of algorithms are great, but there's still a lot of human labor that's needed to make that happen. So after we did all that, we were able to say, okay, let's get as close as we can to a clean or a relatively useful set of data, and we found that about 33,000 museum-related records. This was more than double or close to double what most museum authorities had thought. So this was a big finding. And again, yes, some will question why certain entities are in there and why others are not, but you know, this is where we are. This became what's known as the Museum Universe data file, which is now in the data repository at IMLS. So we said, great, you know, a comma delimited file on a website isn't going to do much for the field. So how do we take this data? How do we integrate important community measures that we heard in our stakeholder interviews through on individuals and households? How could we create an online, intuitive, user-friendly tool that could eventually serve as a platform from which we could build? So from that, we started developing a tool called Museum Stat, which takes the Museum Universe data file and the census data, ACS census data, to create visualizations in real time for users. So I'll show a couple quick screenshots. This is all 33,000 on the map, but you can easily search by museum, zip, you know, city, and start to drill down and get lots of useful information. So immediately you can, for example, pick a museum, and then from there get some detailed information on the people and the households in a 1 mile radius of that museum, for example. Household information, and even a comparison of that region versus the state's perspective of museums. You can also change things like add demographic layers. So you can add, for example, poverty rate, so museums can understand what's happening in a certain area. The tool allows you to select an area or a region and immediately understand the same metrics on that area. So as museum leaders said, this is a way for us to understand how to develop programs in particular communities that have particular needs. Again, the same wealth of information. I'm going very quickly through this, but again, things like median household income provides tools for fundraising for museums. Where are people who have certain means? Where might they live? So all of these things can be easily visualized and quickly visualized for the user. No training needed, no data analysis needed. It's all right there. Everything is flexible and customizable in terms of the region. You can even spit out a canned report from this and include it with a grant application, which is what we were hearing a lot of museum leaders do. So, So from that we said, this is raw data, it exists, all the code is open source. Another thing we did real quick was create a public-facing version of this data called Museum Finder, which uses the same back-end data to quickly show where museums are in people's communities for the public. So again, it was a way to kind of put the data out there and let people know that this is here, this is a tool, and we need to continue to develop these kinds of things to really advance the sector. So that's a very quick spin through of it. But basically what we're doing is we're calling this a beta, and we're going to be developing more. We're getting great feedback at conferences like this and from museum users, and hopefully there's more grant money behind it and we can keep developing it along further. But I thank you for your time and hope you'll check out our tools. Thank you.
Thank you. So tall. Can you hear me at the back? Great. Hi everyone, my name is Angie Judge from Dexhibit, and today I wanted to end up this morning's panel by offering a bit of a product perspective on what we've learned about data visualization from our users, and also touch a little on where the future is taking us in terms of artificial intelligence. Somebody told me yesterday that analytics is a bit too dry, so I brought along a few friends to help explain the tech stack behind the scenes and what we go through from a product development perspective, and then how we move from there into machine learning and natural language generation. But to set the context of where I'm coming from, I think our panel today, each one of us visualizes data for a different user group and a very different audience. And my experience is exclusively in terms of visualization for the museum enterprise. And our work is about pulling together lots of different data, from Wi-Fi to weather to commercial transactions, to help museums understand how they're performing, and that's what we're visualizing. So the thing with this sort of data is that it is big data. There's a huge amount of it. It comes to us in lots of different forms. It's very messy, and it's coming at a great deal of speed. And the eyeballs that we are building for the museum users of 2017 want everything, and they want it right now. And so I think because of that, having an analytics stack in place behind data visualization is a really important part of effective data visualization. It's not enough for us to be able to visualize data manually as a one-off, because for a museum user, say someone in marketing, if they're looking at a visualization produced by hand, as soon as you've made it, it's out of date. So the heavy lifting for data visualization in our world sits behind the scenes. And that way, visualizations keep themselves up to date, and they're more in the moment, and that creates a far more useful thing for the museum to be able to look at what is true today rather than what happened last month. And I often describe this work a bit like an iceberg, because most of the work goes on below the waterline. And in this day and age, hopefully without a man behind the curtain. So once that's all said and done, we can then produce things like this that answer questions like whether an externally facing cafe in the museum is actually drawing visitors into the museum proper. On the left, this is a sunburst diagram, and it shows us how visitors are progressing through the museum space using Wi-Fi data. And on the right-hand side, we have exactly the same data behind it, but with donut charts that help us analyze cross-zone activation. So we can see who went to the cafe, who also went to the lobby, or who went to the lobby, who also went to the cafe. And there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes to produce this, cleaning up this data and identifying all the network noise and allowing for opening hours and scaling factors and audit factors, etc. But when you put things like that in front of a user, you really quickly start to get feedback on what people like and what they don't. And it turns out that some people just don't like graphs. And the geeky among us might think that a sunburst diagram is really cool. Other people will find it just really confusing. And so the reality is that we all like to take information in different ways. Some of us like just the facts. Some of us are very visual creatives. Some of us want to see a story being told, and others of us want to dive right in and analyze the detail. And on top of that, we have lots of different roles in the museum, from marketing to finance to visitor services, all wanting to use data. So from a product perspective, how we've attacked that is to end up profiling these users into different personas and visualizing exactly the same information but in lots of different ways, so that it suits and is personal to those users. So when it comes to product development behind a visualization, we start with an idea or a request. Somebody's got a question they want an answer to. And our job, once we have the data we need, is to work out how to communicate that. So do we use a volumetric like this one here? This is exactly the same information that we were looking at before. Or some type of traditional statistical graph like our donut charts, or some type of illustration like our sunburst. So we'll sketch out a bunch of ideas and take them back to the user, literally with pen and paper at this stage, and help shape that request. And once we've then got that in good form, we can mock it up digitally, and we start testing it amongst other users. So this is all taking place before we even develop it. We need to understand, are the colors right? Is the tooltip right? And what kind of explanation do we need to accompany it with? And then finally, once we actually have a developed product, we then instrument that visualization with its own data. So we need to monitor who of our user group uses that visualization and what else do they use with it. And our objective here is to get to the point where we've got enough data on our own data that we can start recommending to people what sorts of data visualizations they might like. But the thing is that once you then give users what they want and then you design it just for them, the next thing they want to know is where the future is going. So visualizing the past and the present is one thing, but then if we want to visualize things that haven't even happened yet, it starts to get quite tricky. And this is something we've been focusing a lot more on lately. So to achieve this, we've had to develop some machine learning models behind the scenes that can detect all the simultaneous effects that are happening to a museum and start to predict what will happen next. And this is what that is going to look like for us. So here we're not just trying to visualize data, but we're trying to visualize the context around that data. Because when you look at a forecast, the first thing you want to know is, why is there a peak on that day? And how accurate is this forecast? How much can I rely on it? So we need to communicate why and how we're making our predictions. So there's a lot of layers of information that need to be communicated in this visualization alongside the data itself. And then once you can give somebody that crystal ball, the last thing that they tell you is that they don't want to log in anymore. And I must admit, the first time I heard this, it completely freaked me out. And we just built a whole ton of visualizations and dashboards and reporting and forecasting. But what we ended up figuring out was what our users were telling us, that they just wanted insight on the fly. So rather than having to log in and use a dashboard, why couldn't they just Slack a bot for the answer? And why should they even have to ask a question in the first place? So using tools like natural language generation, our strategy moving forward is now to work on translating what would have been a data visualization into language or text. And when you think about it, in an industry like museums, where most of us are more storytellers than statisticians, this kind of makes a lot of sense. And we call this browserless conversational insight, and we think it's going to take us beyond visualization. Thank you.
Okay, so I hope that was all very insightful for you. Thanks to all the panelists here. We have plenty of time for questions. I hope you have questions. Who's got a question? We got a question.
Jeff, you mentioned that a lot of your visualizations were made with free online tools. Can you tell us a little bit about what you used?
Yeah, yep. I really take advantage of D3 and processing. Like that's it. They're pretty straightforward, and processing really is a subset of Java where it's designed for creative coders who just want to get stuff on the screen really fast. And that's what I really like about it. And then D3, because it's plain old JavaScript and HTML, I can run in the browser. I can share it with whoever I want and get it online very fast. The other key thing for us, for me, with using D3 is that we have an API for our collections data, which is free and out there if anyone wants to use the exact same data that I showed you. And it just outputs JSON data, and D3 can take it right in and start rendering it very quickly.
Can anyone speak on, again, using this, if you're doing an assessment at the end, but bringing this all the way back to planning, like how you would use it for exhibit and gallery and other forms of planning so that people understand this data and reuse it, take action? Are there any lessons on doing that?
Any takers? Any takers?
So, for planning exhibitions, is that what you said?
Yeah, or any, just taking this, I can see I can use this for assessment, but then how do you move it back towards a planning, any museum planning process? How do you bring this data back so that it's
Ours is not so much like I don't know that we'll work it into a formalized process. Like, this is part of an evaluation that you do as a reinstallation working group to look at the online metrics for that collection. I think it wouldn't be unwise to consider that, but it isn't formal like that. This is ours for me, for Philadelphia. It was kind of an experiment to say, hey, this trove of Google Analytics information might be informative. The state that we're at now is that I will probably do the same analysis for every curatorial department, because we're undergoing a core project and the whole museum is changing its physical spaces and a lot of galleries are being reinstalled. So my hope is that other curators will sort of open their minds and consider it. But other than that, it's not really a formal process.
I think for us, it was part of a formal process of doing evaluation of what the teachers thought about the workshop, taking that feedback, realizing we had to make some adjustments, and then as moving forward, we've continued to do that evaluation and then iteratively tweak the workshops to make sure we're addressing the needs of the teachers. And moving forward, as we continue to extend our outreach beyond research institutions and museums to other audiences, we'll be using that process of trying a different data visualization, making sure we understand what the audience thinks of it, if they get it, if it's an effective way to communicate, and then tweaking as we need to, because it's really helped us think more broadly about how we're communicating with people through data, because for us, digital is so key in what we do day to day, but to really communicate our processes, we have to really plan and iteratively develop to make sure we're reaching the particular audiences we want to. So for us, we've tried to work it into this process of iterative development, and that means tweaking it every time we do a workshop. So it can mean more work in the end, but we found it more useful that way.
Yeah, I can comment just a little bit in terms of planning and for museum performance. So definitely from a forecasting perspective, that's why we've gone down that route. So everything from capital planning to operational planning, and the sort of departments that respond to that are more around finance, marketing, and visitor services. What we haven't seen yet, though, which I think is where your question is leading, is more planning in the curatorial space of data. So I think that's probably the last department for us to approach to be able to be more predictive in how we're looking at analytics. That's still very much a retrospective area in terms of understanding visitor experience.
Yeah, sorry. Just to add two more sentences to that. Yeah, for me, it's these visualizations are just to have a conversation around and really work with our staff and curators to think about, to just get them to consider their area of specialty in a larger context and how the data might inform some of their future decisions about exhibitions or installations or things like that. So, and I really try to, for our staff, I really try to reinforce this notion of data-informed decisions, not data-driven decisions. That question?
Hi, thank you, Neville, for
Yeah.
your very interesting presentation and your program Museum Finds. As I understand correctly, this is not only for museum professionals, but also for the audiences, right? So if it is also for the audiences, how it
Sorry.
sorry.
So we have a question.
Sorry, there was you probably didn't hear. There was a question up there. We'll come back. So yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Oh yeah. Sorry, yes. Sorry.
So if it's also for the audiences, how is it different from TripAdvisor or Foursquare, which also provides a lot of information on different museums, their geolocations, plus
Right.
they do ranking of museums
Yeah.
and provide feedback from the audiences.
Yeah.
In this dimension, how
Sure.
do we compete with others?
Sure. So, in case you didn't hear, her question was about the Museum Finder app that I quickly showed at the end. Yeah, and how does it differ from all the tourist-based types of tools and apps out there? So, yeah, that's a great question. Really, the Museum Finder was kind of a freebie that we thought, hey, we're putting data out there. It's open source. People can get to it. Let's just create something quick that we can show as an example. here's how you could use this data. So in one sense, it's really about kind of just promoting the use of data. And in the second sense, we're saying, okay, we've got the 33,000, data museums in there that others don't have. And we're hoping it finds those, under the radar kinds of places that aren't reviewed by anybody, but might be in someone's backyard, or they're on a trip and they find some interesting place to visit. So it's not meant to sort of compete with or overlap, but it was just sort of a fun little thing we could do on the side. Yeah. Mhm.
I didn't know we had a museum of pizza.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's in our town.
already learned something.
Yeah. It's actually and it's in the Guinness World Records as the largest pizza memorabilia collection in the world. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Good question.
There's a market there.
Yeah.
Start your own.
In the back,
Yeah. We'll go back. Yeah.
So like with the data visualization tool for the TMS data, do you see any possibility of offering an interactive component to that could be sort of public facing where people could and then you could take the interactive data and actually incorporate it into the visualization?
So for the things I make, all that data is piped out of TMS, and we actually have some toy applications that show some small interactive graphs that could live alongside object pages and things like that. I would love to put some of that stuff in, make it more publicly accessible directly through our own website. Institutional issues prevent some of these things from making their way out there. So the best I can do right now is make all that same raw data available through our API. So if somebody else wants to build a rendering of it and put it out there, they can. And we put our little toy apps off to the side and things like that.
Do you offer do you tell certain groups of people that do you encourage people to do that, or is it just
So one of the things, if you go to our website under Browse Our Collections, is our typical interface, but on that same menu is a link to our API, because our API is a way to browse our collections. And through the documentation there, I try to lay it all out. Here's our data, here's where it comes from, here's the things we know about our data, the things we don't know about it. Here are all the toy apps, here are here's sample code to get you off the up and running. Here are links to running versions of that sample code. It's all there. You kind of have, it's a self-selecting group that's going to go down that path at the moment. So there's definitely a lot of work we could do to bring that into the mainstream of our site. But it's there. Yeah, it's findable.
One of the things that we've done is we've had 2 hackathons, and our API is sort of experimental and internal only. But the things that I can do with the data that I have, limitless. I have that imagination, but I don't know that that's necessarily what anyone wants to see. So I think the more efficient way of doing it is to put, like you said, to put the data out there and let other people experiment with it. It combines community engagement with the sort of hey, what am I going to get out of this? Is it going to be a cool tool that somebody could later use? Is the hackathon going to inspire some sort of project that we could do with that participant? I think that there's a way to make it sort of open a door and let other people kind of grab your data and run with it. And I think you get, in a way, more flexible, kind of interesting tools from that. So yeah.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question to that for you all? I mean, one thing we found is we've put a lot of data out there, and but there have been some challenges with getting people to engage with it, because it can be really overwhelming to just have a data set. So if you're not doing things like hackathons or workshops, have you all found that just putting the data out there is enough, or we really need to be kind of creating processes for people to engage with it that are guided?
So yeah. Sorry. But my 2 quick cents on this is really it comes back to sort of know your audience. We're teaching museum at a research university. I'm going to say that a lot. We have a student community. One of the really big incentives for us putting the data out there is we have CS students out there that need data sets for intro to data, computer science, and they're making websites and they're making apps that are based on APIs and data that's out there. So I'm going to lean on that very hard and put our data out there and promote it in that way. So that's why I've got these creative examples and code samples and like just like reduce the barrier for people to use your data as much as you possibly can, and let them actually get to their idea as quickly as possible.
In data dictionaries.
Yeah, yeah.
Good documentation.
Thorough data documentation is your friend.
Yeah. Was there a question?
So I think we're at time. So yeah, so we're actually out of time, and we're all around here today. If anyone has any questions, please thank the panel for all of their great presentations, and we'll see you around. Yeah, right on time. Your project's really interesting.
I just want to plug one thing for tomorrow. If you had ideas sitting here listening to us and you don't know how to take them back to your institution, MC Energy tomorrow all day long, we'll have facilitators and mentors sitting down talking about how to implement projects. You should come talk to me. I'll be there at 10 and 2.